Rain lashed against the bulletproof glass of the Cadillac, but it couldn't drown out the sound of the little girl's ragged breathing in the back seat. Her tiny hands were stained with thick, dark mud, her coat torn at the shoulder. Just 10 minutes ago, she had breached the heavy doors of my syndicate's front, ignored the guns pointed directly at her chest, and grabbed my pant leg with a grip like iron. "They hung my mom on a tree," she had choked out. "Save her. I am no savior. I'm a monster." But I leaned forward and told my driver to step on it. The back room of La Bella Coda smelled of stale espresso, cigar ash, and the metallic tang of uncounted coinage. It was Tuesday, counting day, which meant the air was thick with the anxiety of my capos and the monotonous hum of money counters. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, a ledger open in front of me, a pen loose in my hand. I didn't like Tuesdays. They reminded me too much of the bureaucracy of violence. "The South Side collections are light," Dom said. He was leaning against the door frame, a massive shadow of a man with a nose that had been broken in 3 different decades. He didn't look at the ledger. He didn't need to. "O'Reilly is holding out. Says the docks are dry." "The docks are never dry," I replied, keeping my voice flat. "Send a message, nothing loud. Break the steering column on his truck. Let him know we're inside his perimeter." Dom nodded, pushing off the door frame. Before he could turn the handle, a sudden sharp clatter echoed from the main dining room beyond the heavy soundproof door. I stopped writing. Dom's hand dropped instinctively to his waist, brushing the fabric of his suit jacket away from the grip of his Sig Sauer. The dining room was closed. The front doors were locked, guarded by 2 men who weighed 300 pounds apiece. There was a shout, a man's voice, rough and surprised, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Then a high-pitched shriek. "Get off me!" The heavy oak door to my office didn't just open. It flew inward, bouncing hard against the doorstop. 2 of my men, Paulie and Sal, stumbled into the room, their faces flushed. But they weren't fighting off a rival crew or police. They were struggling to hold on to a child. She couldn't have been older than 7. She wore a yellow raincoat that was smeared with wet earth and engine grease. One of her sneakers was missing, revealing a muddy sock soaked in dirty street water. She was thrashing wildly, kicking Paulie in the shin with her remaining shoe, her small fist windmilling with a desperate animalistic frenzy. "Boss, I'm sorry," Paulie panted, trying to pin her arms without breaking them. She slipped right past the alley door when the bread delivery came in. "She's a little rat." "Let me go," she screamed. Her voice was raw, tearing at the edges, stripped of the innocence a child her age should possess. Her eyes locked onto mine. She didn't look at the guns. She didn't look at Dom. She looked at the man sitting at the head of the table. She understood power dynamics instantly. "Let her go," I said. "Boss, we don't know." I said, "Let her go, Paulie." Paulie released his grip, stepping back and wiping a streak of mud from his tailored trousers with a grimace. The girl didn't run away. She didn't cower. She marched straight toward me, leaving wet, muddy footprints on the Persian rug. She stopped inches from my chair, her chest heaving. Up close, I could see a scrape across her cheek, welling with fresh blood. Her lips were blue from the cold. "Are you Leo Rossi?" she demanded. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "I am," I said, leaning back slowly. I kept my hands visible on the table. "Who's asking?" "My name is Lily." She reached out, her small, filthy fingers grabbing the expensive wool of my trousers. She gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. "You have to come right now. You have to save her." "Save who, kid?" Dom asked from the corner, his deep voice softening just a fraction. "My mom." Lily's tough facade cracked. A sob hitched in her throat, and a tear cut a clean line down her dirty face. "They took her to the old rail yard, the ones with the snake tattoos. They beat her, and they put a rope around her neck. They hung my mom on a tree. Please." Silence dropped over the room like a heavy blanket. Snake tattoos. The Cobras. A bottom-feeding local crew that ran meth out of the industrial district. They were loud, sloppy, and notoriously cruel. They weren't in my league, and we had an unspoken border. But hanging a woman in the rail yard? That was close to my territory. Too close. "Why did they take her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She owes them money." "For my medicine," Lily choked out, her grip on my pant leg tightening until I felt her nails through the fabric. "She told them she needed one more week." They laughed. The man with the missing teeth said time was up. "Please, please, mister, her feet are on a barrel." But he said he's going to kick it away when the rain stops. I stared down at her. In our world, people owe money, and people pay the price. It is the basic math of the streets. If I saved every degenerate gambler or desperate addict who borrowed from the wrong people, I wouldn't have an empire. I'd have a charity. I should have told Dom to hand her off to child services. I should have closed the ledger and moved on to the north side numbers. But I looked at her empty, muddy sock. I looked at the sheer terror in her eyes, a terror that hadn't completely drowned out a fierce, burning defiance. She wasn't just begging, she was demanding. She was fighting for her mother's life with the only weapon she had, stepping into the lion's den and demanding the lion hunt for her. I closed the ledger. The heavy thud of the cover echoed in the quiet room. I stood up. Lily scrambled back a step, suddenly realizing how tall I was. "Dom," I said, grabbing my overcoat from the rack, "get the car." Dom didn't ask questions. He just racked the slide of his Sig Sauer and opened the door. The interior of the Cadillac was dead silent, save for the heavy rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. The rain was coming down in sheets now, washing the neon lights of the city into blurred, bloody smears against the glass. I sat in the back with Lily. Dom was in the passenger seat, his massive frame silhouetted by the passing streetlights, while our driver, Carlo, navigated the slick roads with quiet efficiency. Lily sat rigidly on the edge of the leather seat. She hadn't leaned back. She was perched like a bird ready to take flight, her eyes locked on the road ahead, her hands trembling in her lap. She was leaving a damp, muddy stain on the pristine beige leather, a detail that would normally have me tearing Carlo a new one. But right now, it didn't register. I pulled a clean linen handkerchief from my breast pocket and held it out to her. She flinched slightly, her eyes darting to my hand, then to my face. "Wipe the blood off your cheek," I said, keeping my voice steady and low. "It's dripping." She hesitated, then took the cloth. She didn't wipe her face. Instead, she twisted the expensive fabric between her small, bruised fingers, using it as an anchor for her anxiety. "Turn left at the next light," she told Carlo suddenly, her voice cracking. "Past the old brewery." "I know the way, kid," Carlo muttered, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Faster," she whispered. I looked at her profile. "What's your mother's name?" "Clara," she answered, not taking her eyes off the road. "Clara Evans." "And the man who took her, the one with the missing teeth. Do you know his name?" The others called him Ricky, she said, swallowing hard. Ricky the Rat. Ricky the Rat Vargas. A mid-level enforcer for the Cobras. A coward who preferred his victims bound and helpless. The anger that had been simmering in my gut since I left the restaurant crystallized into a cold, hard focus. "Why did you come to me, Lily?" I asked. It was a genuine question. The syndicate wasn't listed in the phone book under Neighborhood Watch. She finally turned to look at me. The street lights washed over her face, highlighting the deep, dark bags under her eyes. "My mom told me about you," she said softly. "She works at the diner on 4th Street. She said Mr. Rossi is a scary man. She said Mr. Rossi does bad things. But she also said Mr. Rossi doesn't let anyone hurt kids in his neighborhood." She gripped the handkerchief tighter. I knew the police wouldn't get there in time. They don't care about people in the Narrows. So I ran to your restaurant. I felt a strange tightness in my jaw. Clara Evans. I knew the diner on 4th. I got coffee there sometimes when I needed to get out of my own head. I vaguely remembered a waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile, who always remembered I took my coffee black. She thought I was a monster, but a monster with a code. She wasn't wrong. "We're crossing over the tracks," Dom announced from the front, breaking the tension. He unclipped his seatbelt and checked the magazine of his sidearm for the 3rd time. A habit. "Entering the rail yard now. It's a maze back here, boss. Lots of blind spots." "Kill the headlights," I ordered Carlo. The heavy car plunged into darkness, navigating solely by the ambient glow of the distant city and the flashes of lightning. The road turned from asphalt to cracked concrete, then to gravel and mud. Rusting husks of old train cars loomed out of the darkness like massive dead iron beasts. The smell of wet rust, rotting wood, and chemical runoff seeped into the cabin. "Where, Lily?" I asked, leaning forward. She pressed her face against the cold glass. "There," she pointed a trembling finger. "By the old water tower. There's a clearing." Through the rain I saw it. A faint, flickering yellow light. Headlights from a pair of beat-up pickup trucks, illuminating the massive, sprawling branches of a dead oak tree that stood defiantly amidst the industrial decay. "Stop here," I told Carlo. The Cadillac rolled to a silent halt behind a line of rusted shipping containers out of sight. "Dom, you're with me. Carlo, stay with the girl. Keep the engine running and the doors locked." I turned to Lily. She was shaking uncontrollably now, her eyes wide with terror as she stared toward the faint light. I reached out and gently placed a hand on her small shoulder. She jumped, but then leaned into the touch just a fraction. "Listen to me, Lily," I said, locking my eyes onto hers. "You stay in this car. Do not open the door. Do not look out the window. I am going to bring your mother back. Do you understand?" She swallowed hard, a fresh tear tracking through the mud on her face, and nodded once. I opened the door and stepped out into the freezing rain. I reached beneath my overcoat and pulled my Colt 1911 from its shoulder holster. The metal was cold, familiar, grounding. Dom flanked me, moving with terrifying silence for a man his size. "We going loud, boss?" "Only if we have to," I said, the rain instantly plastering my hair to my forehead. "Let's see the board first." We moved through the shadows, keeping the rusted train cars between us and the clearing, the sound of the rain masking our footsteps. As we got closer, the voices became audible over the storm. Rough, cruel laughter, the clinking of beer bottles. We reached the edge of the clearing and crouched behind a pile of rotting railroad ties. I peered over the wood, wiping the rain from my eyes. The scene hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The headlights of the two pickup trucks bathed the dead oak tree in harsh, unforgiving light. Hanging from one of the thickest, lowest branches was a thick braided rope, and at the end of that rope was Clara. She wasn't fully suspended. Not yet. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back with zip ties, pulling her shoulders into an agonizing, unnatural angle. The noose was secured tightly around her neck, biting into the pale skin. Her only lifeline was a rusted, dented oil drum she was standing on. She was balancing precariously on the very tips of her toes. Her head was tilted back, her face a mask of absolute, suffocating terror. She was gasping for air, the rope already tight enough to restrict her breathing. Every time she slipped, the rope choked her, forcing her to push back up on legs that were visibly shaking from exhaustion. Her clothes were torn, and blood dripped from a cut on her forehead, washing away in the rain. Standing around the barrel were 4 men. I recognized Ricky Vargas immediately. He was wearing a cheap leather jacket, holding a crowbar, and laughing as he tapped the side of the oil drum. Every tap made the metal echo and caused Clara to whimper, her balance shifting dangerously. "You got about 2 minutes left of leg strength, Clara," Ricky sneered, his missing front teeth making him whistle slightly. "Maybe less, considering you skipped breakfast." The other 3 goons laughed. One was leaning against a truck, smoking a cigarette, keeping a shotgun rested lazily in the crook of his arm. The other 2 were drinking from flasks, completely unbothered by the slow murder happening in front of them. "Where is it, Clara?" Ricky demanded, stepping closer and tapping the drum harder. Clara gasped, her eyes rolling wildly. "Where's the $1,000 you owe us? I know you've been hiding tips." "Please," she rasped, her voice barely a squeak. My daughter." "Yeah, the little brat ran off," Ricky scoffed. "Probably fell in the river." "You should have paid up, Clara. Now you're an example." He raised his boot, resting the sole against the side of the oil drum. He was going to kick it. There was no time for negotiation, no time to circle around. "Take the one with the shotgun," I whispered to Dom, my voice ice cold. I didn't wait for his confirmation. I stepped out from behind the railroad ties, raising the Colt. Crack, crack. The heavy roar of my .45 shattered the noise of the storm. 2 hollow-point rounds slammed into the chest of the goon holding the flask nearest to Ricky. He folded instantly, dead before his body hit the mud. Almost simultaneously, Dom Sig Sauer barked. The man with the shotgun took a round to the shoulder, spinning him violently. He screamed, dropping the weapon as he fell back against the truck. Ricky froze, his boot still resting on the barrel. He whipped his head around, his eyes going wide with shock as he stared into the darkness. "Who the hell?" I stepped fully into the light, keeping the gun trained squarely on his face. Dom moved up beside me, his weapon aimed at the remaining uninjured man who slowly raised his hands, dropping his beer bottle into the mud. "Step away from the barrel, Vargas," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the rain with lethal authority. Ricky squinted, rain dripping from his nose. Recognition slowly dawned on his face, followed instantly by naked panic. "Rossi," he breathed. "Mr. Rossi, this ain't your territory. This is Cobra business. Personal debt." "I don't care," I said, continuing my steady walk toward him. I didn't break eye contact. "Take your foot off the barrel." Ricky swallowed, his eyes darting to the dead man in the mud, then back to me. His bravado was gone, replaced by the cornered rat instinct that gave him his name. But instead of backing down, his face twisted in a panicked snarl. "We got an agreement," Ricky shouted, his hand trembling on the crowbar. "You can't just walk in here." "I am walking in here," I interrupted, stopping 10 feet away. "And if your foot moves forward instead of backward, I'm going to put a bullet through your left eye. Then I'm going to find your boss and feed him your heart." For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the rain felt suspended. I watched the muscles in Ricky's jaw twitch. He was calculating his odds. He made the wrong choice. With a scream of frustrated rage, Ricky shoved his boot forward, kicking the oil drum hard. "No!" The metallic clang rang out. The drum tipped, scraping violently against the gravel. Clara dropped. The rope snapped taut with a horrifying crunch. Clara's hands jerked upward behind her back, and she began to violently convulse, kicking empty air. I didn't blink. I pulled the trigger. The bullet took Ricky in the kneecap. He shrieked, his leg giving out beneath him as he crashed into the mud, clutching his shattered joint. I ignored him. I dropped my gun into the mud and sprinted forward. Dom was already moving, putting 2 rounds into the last standing goon who had foolishly reached for his belt. I hit the oak tree with my shoulder, grabbing Clara by the waist. I hoisted her up with everything I had, taking the weight off the rope. She was choking, her face turning a deep, terrifying shade of purple. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Her boots scrambled against my chest, desperately trying to find purchase. "Dom! The knife!" I roared, straining to hold her up. She was slight, but dead weight is heavy, and the mud made my boots slide. Dom was there in a second. He vaulted over Ricky's writhing body, whipping a serrated combat knife from his belt. He reached over my shoulder and sawed frantically at the thick rope just above the knot. "Hold her, boss, hold her!" Dom grunted, the heavy blade biting through the hemp. "I got her! Cut it!" With a final desperate tear, the rope gave way. The sudden release sent Claire and me tumbling backward into the wet gravel. I hit the ground hard, wrapping my arms around her to cushion her fall. She landed on top of me, entirely limp. "Clara," I said, rolling her off me and onto her back. The noose was still tight around her neck, cutting deep into the flesh. I grabbed the heavy knot, my fingers slipping on the wet rope and her blood. I yanked it loose, pulling the coils away from her throat. Nothing. She wasn't breathing. "Clara, come on," I growled, pressing my fingers to the side of her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but faint, thready. I tilted her head back, opening her airway, and did the only thing I could think of. I delivered a sharp, open-handed slap to her cheek. "Breathe." For a second, there was only the sound of the rain and Ricky's pathetic whimpering nearby. Then Clara's chest heaved. She let out a horrific rattling gasp, sucking in air like a drowning victim breaking the surface. She rolled onto her side, coughing violently, retching bile and rainwater into the mud. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, resting back on my heels. The cold mud soaked through my slacks, but I didn't care. I watched her heave, her chest rising and falling. She was alive. Dom stepped up next to me, his gun aimed down at Ricky, who was clutching his bleeding knee, sobbing in the dirt. "What do we do with the rat, boss?" Dom asked calmly. I looked down at Clara. She was slowly opening her eyes, blinking against the harsh headlights. Her gaze found mine, confused, terrified, and utterly exhausted. She didn't recognize me at first. Then, she weakly reached a hand toward her own throat. Lily, she rasped. She's safe, I said softly. She's waiting in my car. Clara closed her eyes, letting her head fall back into the mud, a sob tearing through her ruined throat. I stood up slowly, picking my Colt up from the ground and wiping the mud from the barrel. I turned to look down at Ricky Vargas. Please, Ricky begged, spit flying from his lips. Please, Rossi, I'm bleeding out. Dom, I said, my voice dead and empty. Put him on the barrel. Dom, I repeated, the rain flattening my hair against my skull. Put him on the barrel. Ricky stopped crying. The abrupt silence from the mud was heavier than the storm. He stared up at me, his face pale and slack, with sudden absolute comprehension. He tried to scramble backward, his hands slipping in the slick earth, dragging his shattered knee behind him. No, Rossi, no, Ricky babbled, his voice pitching high. I was just following orders. Hector told me to make an example. You know how it is, it's just business. Dom didn't speak. He stepped forward, grabbed the collar of Ricky's cheap leather jacket, and hauled him upward with a sharp grunt. Ricky screamed as his ruined leg took gravity. Dom dragged him toward the dented oil drum, righted it with a kick, and hoisted the man onto the top. Ricky wavered violently, his good leg shaking as he tried to balance. Dom reached up, grabbed the severed end of the noose hanging from the oak branch, and looped it loosely around Ricky's neck. He didn't tie a new slip knot. He didn't have to. The message was the message. Let him balance, I said, turning away. I knelt beside Clara in the mud. She was shivering uncontrollably now, her body going into deep shock. I slid my arms under her knees and behind her back, lifting her against my chest. She weighed next to nothing. Her head lolled against my shoulder, her breath coming in ragged, whistling wheezes that sounded like tearing paper. Hold on, I muttered, starting the trek back toward the shipping containers. The walk felt longer this time. The adrenaline was receding, leaving a cold, sharp clarity in its wake. 3 dead cobras in the mud. A mid-level enforcer left teetering on a barrel. Hector Chavez, the boss of the Cobras, was a volatile man who considered the rail yard his personal kingdom. I hadn't just crossed a border. I had bulldozed it. I reached the Cadillac. Carlo had the rear door open before I even cleared the rusted train cars. The interior light bathed the wet gravel in a soft yellow glow. Lily was pressed against the far door, her eyes wide. A muddy hand clamped over her mouth. When she saw the limp figure in my arms, a sound tore out of her, a raw, guttural noise that didn't belong in a child. She scrambled across the leather seats, ignoring the mud, reaching out with frantic hands. Mom! Mommy! I carefully laid Clara across the back seat. The moment her head touched the leather, Lily was on her, burying her face into Clara's soaked, torn coat. Clara's eyes fluttered open. Her hands, still trembling violently, came up to clumsily stroke Lily's wet hair. I'm here, baby, Clara rasped. Her voice was barely a croak, destroyed by the friction of the rope. I'm here. I closed the door on them and walked around to the front, climbing into the passenger seat. Dom slid in behind me a second later, pulling the heavy door shut and locking the cold out. The smell of cordite, wet earth, and copper instantly filled the cabin. Go, I told Carlo. The Cadillac's heavy tires spun for a fraction of a second in the mud before finding traction. We pulled away from the clearing, leaving the dead oak tree and the harsh pickup headlights behind. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Where to, boss? Carlo asked, keeping his eyes on the dark, cracked road. The restaurant? No, I said. The restaurant was public. It was a place for business, for the syndicate. The woman bleeding in the back seat didn't belong there. The estate. Call Dr. Harmon. Tell him to meet us there. Tell him to bring a trauma kit. Dom shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight. Harmon is going to ask questions, Leo. Harmon gets paid $10,000 a month to not ask questions, I replied quietly. I stared out the windshield at the hypnotic rhythm of the wipers. Behind me, the only sounds were Lily's quiet hiccups and the terrifying, raspy intake of Clara's breathing. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The screen lit up my hands. There was blood on my knuckles. Clara's blood. I thought about the ledger sitting on my desk back at La Bella Coda. I thought about the neat, orderly columns of numbers. Southside collections. Doc payoffs. It was a system built on predictability. Tonight, I had taken a sledgehammer to that predictability. All for a waitress who served me black coffee on Tuesday mornings and a kid in a yellow raincoat. Dom, I said without turning my head. When we get to the house, put the perimeter on high alert. Nobody comes through the gates unless I clear it personally. And call Sal. Tell him to pull the boys from the docks and double the guard at the restaurant. You think Hector moves tonight? Dom asked. Hector is a reactionary, I said. He'll find out about the rail yard within the hour. By sunrise, he's going to want blood. Make sure it isn't ours. The iron gates of my compound parted smoothly, the heavy motors completely silent. The tires hissed against the paved driveway, curving up toward the main house. The property sat high in the northern hills, miles away from the grime of the Narrow and the industrial rot of the rail yard. It was a fortress dressed as a mansion, surrounded by thick woods and a 10-foot stone wall. Harmon's black Mercedes was already idling in the circular driveway. Carlo parked near the front steps. Before the car fully stopped, Dom was out, scanning the tree line by pure instinct. I opened the rear door. Lily looked up at me, her small hand still gripping her mother's coat. "We're here," I said softly. "Let me help her." Clara tried to sit up on her own, her face tightening in a grimace of pain. The bruising around her neck was already turning a sickening shade of deep violet and black. It looked like a permanent collar. She managed to swing her legs out, but when her boots touched the pavement, her knees buckled. I caught her by the waist. She flinched violently at the contact, a sharp gasp tearing from her ruined throat. "I won't hurt you," I said, keeping my hand steady, supporting her weight without restricting her. "Walk with me." We moved up the wide stone steps, Lily trailing right behind us, her eyes locked onto her mother's back. Inside, the house was warm. The air smelled of beeswax and wood smoke from the massive fireplace in the foyer. The contrast between the cold, muddy hell we had just left and the quiet opulence of the estate was jarring. I saw Clara's eyes dart around, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the marble floors, the heavy mahogany furniture. It was the house of a mob boss. She knew it, and the fear in her eyes spiked again. Dr. Harmon was waiting in the first-floor guest suite. He was an older man, bald, with wire-rimmed glasses and a pragmatic demeanor born from decades of stitching up bullet holes in basements. "Lay her on the bed," Harmon directed, opening his leather medical bag on a side table. I set Clara down gently on the pristine white duvet. The mud from her clothes instantly ruined the fabric, a dark stain spreading beneath her. She didn't seem to notice. Her hand immediately shot out, grabbing Lily and pulling the girl tight against her side. "I need to examine her neck, Leo," Harmon said, stepping closer with a pen light. Clara pressed herself deeper into the pillows, her arm locking around Lily. She was staring at me, not the doctor. "It's all right, Clara," I said, stepping back toward the door to give her space. "He's a doctor. He's going to make sure your throat isn't swelling shut. Let him work." She hesitated, her breathing shallow and fast. Finally, she gave a microscopic nod, loosening her grip on Lily just enough for Harmon to step in. "I'll be in my study," I told Dom, who was standing like a statue in the hallway. "Get the kids something to eat, a sandwich, hot tea, whatever she wants." I walked down the hall and pushed open the heavy oak doors of my study. I poured 2 fingers of Lagavulin into a crystal glass and drank it neat. The burn down my throat was a sharp reminder of the rasp in Clara's voice. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the dark property. The rain was still falling. An hour passed. The quiet murmur of Harmon's voice drifted down the hall, followed eventually by the heavy click of his medical bag snapping shut. A moment later, the study door opened. Harmon walked in, wiping his hands on a towel. "How is she?" I asked, setting the empty glass on my desk. "Lucky," Harmon said flatly. "Another 10 seconds on that rope, and you'd be paying me to sign a death certificate. She has a severely bruised trachea, microhemorrhaging in her eyes from the pressure, and deep tissue lacerations around the neck. The skin is broken. I've cleaned it and applied a topical antibiotic to prevent infection from that filthy rope. She needs ice, anti-inflammatories, and complete vocal rest." "But she'll live." "She will. But she's terrified, Leo," Harmon added, lowering his voice. "She asked me if she was a prisoner." I felt my jaw tighten. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I just fixed the plumbing." Harmon picked up his coat. "I left painkillers on the nightstand. Keep an eye on her breathing. If it gets shallower, call me back immediately. Her airway could still swell." After Harmon left, I walked back down the hall. The door to the guest suite was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly. Lily was asleep, curled into a tight ball at the foot of the massive bed. Someone, probably Dom, shockingly, had found a heavy wool blanket and draped it over her. Clara was awake. She was propped up against the headboard, an ice pack wrapped in a towel held gently against her throat. Her eyes tracked me the moment I stepped into the room. The fear was still there, a constant vibrating undercurrent. I pulled a heavy armchair from the corner and set it a few feet from the bed. I sat down, resting my elbows on my knees. "The doctor says you're going to be fine." I kept my voice low so as not to wake the kid. Clara nodded slowly. She lowered the ice pack. "Thank you," she mouthed. She didn't use her voice. The effort was clearly too painful. "You don't need to thank me." She stared at me, her exhausted eyes searching my face. Then she raised her hand and made a rubbing motion with her thumb and fingers. "Money." "How much do I owe you?" She forced the words out in a painful, airy whisper. I looked at the bruising on her neck. I thought about Ricky Vargas tapping the side of the barrel, laughing. "Nothing," I said. Clara shook her head, a cynical, defeated look crossing her face. She lived in the Narrows. She knew how the world worked. Men like me didn't do favors. Debts were just transferred from one ledger to another. "You owed the Cobras $1,000, I said, leaning back in the chair. "Hector Chavez doesn't own you anymore. And I am not a loan shark, Clara. I don't buy people. You are a guest in my house until you are well enough to walk out the front gates. That is the end of the transaction." She blinked, a tear slipping out and running down her bruised cheek. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the edge of Lily's blanket. "Why?" she whispered. "Because your daughter walked into a room full of loaded guns and demanded I do my job," I said. A ghost of a smile touched my lips. "She's intimidating." Clara looked down at Lily, her expression softening into something overwhelmingly vulnerable. The hard shell of the street-smart diner waitress cracked entirely. She leaned her head back against the wood, closing her eyes, and finally let out a long, shuddering breath. "Sleep, Clara," I told her, standing up. "My men are at the doors. No one is coming for you tonight." As I closed the door behind me, I knew it was a promise I could keep for the night. But tomorrow was a different story. The smell of black coffee and frying bacon hit me before I even reached the kitchen the next morning. I walked in to find Paulie standing at the industrial stove, awkwardly flipping bacon with a pair of tongs. His shoulder holster prominently displayed over his dress shirt. Sitting at the massive marble island was Lily. She had been washed, her face free of mud, her hair combed, and was wearing an oversized t-shirt that belonged to one of the house staff. She was demolishing a plate of scrambled eggs. She stopped chewing when I walked in, her fork freezing halfway to her mouth. "Morning, kid," I said casually, walking past her to pour a cup of coffee. She slowly lowered the fork. "Is my mom awake?" "Not yet," I said, leaning against the counter. "She needs a lot of sleep. Dr. Harmon said she has to stay quiet today. So if you go in there, keep it down." Lily nodded seriously. She looked at Paulie, then back at me. "Paulie makes good eggs, but he curses a lot when the grease pops." Paulie choked back a cough, turning bright red. "Sorry, boss, slipped out." "Watch your mouth around the kid, Paulie," I muttered, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. The heavy kitchen doors swung open, and Vincent walked in. Vincent was my consigliere. At 65, he was the oldest man in my inner circle, a relic from my father's era. He wore impeccably tailored three-piece suits and carried an aura of permanent disappointment. He didn't look at Paulie, and he completely ignored Lily. He walked straight to me, his face carved from stone. "We need to talk, Leo," Vincent said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any pleasantries. "My office." I set the mug down. I gave Lily a brief nod and followed Vincent down the hall to the private conference room. Dom was already there, standing by the window, his arms crossed over his chest. Vincent shut the door carefully and turned to me. "3 dead on the rail yard gravel," Vincent began, ticking them off on his fingers. Ricky Vargas left standing on a barrel with a rope around his neck, screaming for the cops until the yard workers found him at 5 a.m. His kneecap is powder. He'll never walk right again. "Good," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Saves him money on tap dancing shoes." Vincent didn't smile. "Hector Chavez called the restaurant an hour ago. He didn't speak to Paulie. He demanded me. He is out of his mind, Leo. He says you violated the treaty. He says you slaughtered his men over a civilian debt. They were hanging a woman, Vince. They were conducting their business in their territory." Vincent slammed a hand on the table. It was a rare break in his composure. "It's $1,000 debt, Leo. $1,000. We bring in 80 grand a week from the South Side alone. You started a war over pocket change and a waitress." "I didn't start it over the money," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I started it because they were stringing up a mother in front of her child in my city. They're animals. I put them down. We are not the police, Leo. Vincent shot back, leaning over the table. "We are the syndicate. We survive on rules. We survive on borders. You cross the tracks. Hector is demanding a sit-down tonight at the neutral zone in the warehouse district. He wants reparations, and he wants the woman returned to finish the transaction." The air in the room seemed to evaporate. I looked at Dom. Dom didn't move a muscle, but his eyes locked onto mine. He knew what my answer would be. I stood up slowly. I walked to the mahogany cabinet against the wall, poured myself another coffee from the carafe, and took my time stirring it. "Tell Hector," I finally said, turning to face Vincent, "that there will be no reparations. Tell him that if he wants to sit down, he can sit down on the spineless coward he sent to hang a woman. And tell him that Clara Evans and her daughter are under my personal protection." Vincent stared at me aghast. "Leo, you are throwing the entire syndicate into the fire for strangers." "They aren't strangers anymore," I said coldly. "They are under my roof. That makes them mine to protect." "Hector has 200 men in the Narrows," Vincent warned, his voice tight with frustration. "They are street thugs, yes, but they are armed, high on their own supply, and completely unpredictable. They will start hitting our supply lines. They will firebomb the fronts. Let them try." I stepped closer to Vincent, closing the distance. "Sal runs a crew of shooters that make Hector's boys look like Boy Scouts. Call Sal. Tell him to arm the men. Double the shifts. Anyone with a snake tattoo caught north of the tracks gets put in the river. No warnings." "This is madness, Leo." "It's an eviction notice," I corrected. "Hector has been getting too comfortable lately anyway. This city doesn't have room for a syndicate and a cartel. We've tolerated the Cobras because they stayed in the dirt. If Hector wants to crawl out of the dirt and play in my yard, I'll bury him in it." Vincent stared at me for a long time. He was looking for the pragmatic businessman my father had raised. He couldn't find him. He found the monster that the little girl had unleashed last night. "I will make the call," Vincent finally said, his shoulders slumping slightly. "But God help us, Leo. The streets are going to bleed tonight." Vincent walked out of the room. I stood in the silence for a moment, listening to the heavy tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I walked back out to the kitchen. Paulie was cleaning the stove. Lily had finished her eggs and was sitting quietly on the stool, her legs kicking back and forth. She looked up at me as I walked in. She slid off the stool and walked over. She didn't say a word. She just reached out, wrapped her small arms around my leg, and buried her face in the fabric of my trousers. It was a simple, silent anchor. I rested my hand on top of her head. "Paulie," I said, looking down at the kid, "go to the armory. Bring up the heavy rifles. We're locking down the estate." War was coming. But for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I was fighting for. The retaliation didn't wait for nightfall. Hector Chavez was a creature of ego, and leaving one of his enforcers strung up on an oil drum in the middle of his own territory was an insult that demanded daylight violence. By noon, the Narrows were burning. I sat in the study, watching the live feeds from the security cameras mounted outside La Bella Coda and the Southside warehouses. On Monitor 3, a rusted panel van jumped the curb in front of the restaurant. 4 men in ski masks piled out, carrying cheap, heavy cans of gasoline and a pump-action shotgun. They didn't make it to the front door. Saul's crew had been waiting. The feed showed the tinted windows of a black SUV parked across the street rolling down. There was no sound on the video, just the sudden jerky collapse of the man holding the shotgun. The other three panicked, dropping the gas cans, slipping in the spilled fuel as they scrambled to get back into the van. A second volley shattered the van's windshield. The driver slumped over the wheel. The remaining two ran down the alley, abandoning their vehicle. I picked up the phone on the desk. "Sal." "Handled, boss." Sal's voice came through, completely flat, accompanied by the background noise of passing traffic. "They sent kids, hopheads, amateurs. We left the van as a warning. Police are 5 minutes out. We're moving to the secondary location." "Good. Hold the line. Hector is testing our response time. He's going to escalate." I hung up. A soft knock on the study door pulled my attention away from the screens. The heavy oak swung open, and Clara stood in the doorway. She was wearing a thick, oversized wool sweater that belonged to one of the maids. The bruising around her throat had deepened to an ugly, mottled black and purple, stark against her pale skin. She looked exhausted, holding a mug of tea with both hands. But she was standing under her own power. "You shouldn't be walking around," I said, leaning back in the leather chair. "Dr. Harmon said you need rest." Clara stepped fully into the room. She didn't look at the security feeds on the monitors. She kept her eyes on me. She reached up, gingerly touching her throat. When she spoke, her voice was a rough, painful rasp. "I can't sleep," she croaked. "There are men with rifles on your roof. Just a precaution. Don't lie to me." She stepped closer, setting her mug on the edge of my desk. Her hands were shaking. "I know who the Cobras are. I know how Hector Chavez operates. He isn't going to let this go. He's coming for you because of me. He's coming for me because he thinks he has the leverage to do so," I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly level. "This was inevitable, Clara. The Cobras have been pushing the boundaries of the Narrows for 6 months. You were just the match that lit the powder keg. If it wasn't you, it would have been someone else next week." "They are going to kill people," she whispered, a tear spilling over her lower lash line. "Your men. Over a diner waitress." I stood up, walking around the heavy desk. She instinctively took a half step back, her shoulders tensing. I stopped, leaving 3 feet of space between us. I needed her to understand the reality of the situation without the filter of fear she was accustomed to. "Look at me, Clara," I said. She raised her eyes. They were a muted, tired brown, hollowed out by years of working double shifts and looking over her shoulder. "My men know what they signed up for. They are paid incredibly well to understand the risks of their employment," I told her quietly. "You didn't sign up to be a casualty of my city's politics. You owed a debt to a monster, and he decided to make a public spectacle of your death. I don't allow that. Not here. You are not a burden. You are the line in the sand." Clara stared at me, searching my face for the lie. She had spent her entire adult life navigating the cruel transactional nature of the world. The concept of absolute, unconditional protection was entirely foreign to her. "Where's Lily?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Kitchen," I said. "Dom is teaching her how to play gin rummy. She's already taken $20 off him." A small, fractured laugh escaped Clara's lips, quickly turning into a grimace as the movement pulled at her bruised throat. She closed her eyes, the tension bleeding out of her spine, just a fraction. "She likes it here," Clara admitted, opening her eyes. "She told me the big man with the broken nose makes her feel safe." "Dom is good at that," I said. "You should go back to bed. The heavy lifting is done out there. Now we just wait for Hector to make a mistake." "And when he does?" "Then I finish the paperwork," I said. She nodded slowly, picking up her tea. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. "Thank you, Leo." It was the first time she had used my first name. It sounded strange coming from her, rough and broken, but incredibly grounding. "Get some sleep, Clara." Hector Chavez made his mistake at 2 a.m. on Thursday. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city locked in a damp, freezing cold. I was in the armory in the basement, loading a fresh magazine into my Colt when Vincent walked in. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, the deep lines around his mouth carved into permanent frowns. "Sal found him," Vincent said, leaning heavily against the concrete wall. "Hector isn't in the Narrows. He abandoned his own territory. He's hiding out in the old meatpacking plant on the East River edge. He has maybe 20 guys with him. The rest of his crew is scattered, dealing with the fires Sal started." "The meatpacking plant has 3 exits," I noted, slamming the magazine home and racking the slide. 2 loading docks and a fire door. "Sal has men on all 3, Vincent confirmed. "They are waiting for your word. Leo, you don't have to go down there. Sal is a professional. Let him handle the execution." "Hector sent his men to hang a woman, Vince," I said, holstering the weapon and grabbing a heavy Kevlar-lined coat from the rack. "And then he demanded I return her to him so he could finish the job. This isn't just syndicate business anymore. It's personal." Vincent sighed, a heavy rattling sound. "You're changing the rules, Leo. A boss doesn't clear out a rat's nest himself." "The rules are whatever I write in the ledger," I replied, walking past him. The drive to the East River was fast and completely silent. Dom was driving, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Carlo was in the back with a suppressed submachine gun resting across his knees. We pulled into a deserted alley 2 blocks from the plant. The smell of the river, brine, industrial runoff, and rotting fish permeated the cold air. Sal stepped out of the shadows, dressed in dark tactical gear, carrying a suppressed rifle. "He's in the main cold storage room on the 2nd floor, Sal whispered, handing me a tactical earpiece. "We've disabled the exterior cameras. His guys are strung out. Half of them are sleeping on the loading dock." "We go through the front," I ordered. "Quietly at first, take the guards. But when we hit the 2nd floor, we go loud. I want Hector to know exactly who is coming through that door." We moved out. The shadows of the industrial park swallowed us whole. The gravel crunched softly under our boots. The initial breach was clinical. Sal's men were ghosts. 2 Cobras smoking cigarettes by the loading dock were dropped with muffled thuds before they even realized the dark had teeth. We bypassed the heavy rolling doors and slipped through a rusted side entrance. Inside, the plant smelled of old blood and ammonia. The power was partially out, leaving the massive, cavernous processing floors bathed in the flickering orange glow of emergency lights. We moved up the metal stairwell, the grated steps groaning slightly under our combined weight. At the 2nd floor landing, 2 men were standing guard outside heavy insulated steel doors. They were wide awake, holding automatic weapons. I didn't wait for Sal. I stepped around the corner, raised the Colt, and fired twice. The roar of the unsuppressed .45 in the enclosed concrete stairwell was deafening. It hit like a physical shockwave. Both guards folded, their weapons clattering uselessly against the grating. The element of surprise was gone. That was the point. "Breach!" Dom bellowed. He hit the steel doors with his shoulder, sending them flying inward. The cold storage room was massive, lined with rusted meat hooks hanging from ceiling tracks. At the far end, Behind a makeshift barricade of overturned metal tables and crates, Hector Chavez was scrambling to his feet. Gunfire erupted instantly, the air filled with the sharp, cracking sounds of automatic weapons and the sparking ricochets of bullets hitting steel. I ducked behind a thick concrete pillar, the air beside my head snapping as a round missed me by inches. "Suppressing fire!" Sal shouted. His men unleashed a hail of bullets toward the barricade, shredding the wooden crates and forcing the remaining Cobras to keep their heads down. I checked my angle. Hector was shouting in Spanish, his voice shrill with panic, blindly firing a pistol over the top of a table. He was cornered. I stepped out from behind the pillar, keeping my stance wide and low, and moved forward through the crossfire. Dom flanked me, methodically putting single shots into anyone who dared to stand up. "Hold fire!" I roared, the command echoing off the metal walls. Sal's men ceased immediately. The sudden silence was ringing, heavy with the smell of cordite and copper. "Hector!" I called out. My voice was calm, cutting through the ringing in the air. "Stand up!" A moment passed. The sound of harsh, panicked breathing drifted from behind the metal table. Slowly, Hector Chavez stood up. He was a thin, wiry man with a neck covered in ink. He was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his eyes wide and darting, looking at the bodies of his men scattered across the bloody concrete floor. He still held his pistol, but his hand was shaking so badly the barrel was vibrating. "Rossi," Hector spat, his voice trembling. "You're a dead man. The cartel doesn't care about a street-level meth dealer who can't even hold his own warehouse," I interrupted, walking steadily toward him. "Drop the gun, Hector." Hector looked at his weapon, then at me. His face twisted in a desperate, ugly sneer. "All this for a waitress? You're weak, Rossi. You went soft." He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at my chest. I didn't break stride. I didn't blink. I raised the Colt and fired once. The heavy round took him dead center in the chest. The impact threw him backward, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the ceiling before clattering to the floor. Hector hit the concrete hard, gasping, staring up at the rusted meat hooks above him. I walked over and looked down at him. He was trying to press his hands against the massive hole in his chest, blood bubbling past his fingers. "I'm not soft, Hector," I said softly, looking into his fading eyes. "I just decided to clean my city." I turned my back on him as the life left his body. "Sal," I called out, holstering my weapon, "burn this place to the ground. Leave nothing but ash." The smell of fresh snow was a stark contrast to the scent of gunpowder that had lingered in my nose for a week. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 14 days since Lily had run into La Bella Coda. The gang war was over. With Hector dead and his lieutenants scattered or buried, the Cobras simply ceased to exist. The syndicate absorbed the Narrows, enforcing a strict ban on the cheap narcotics that had been poisoning the streets. Vincent was busy cooking the books, hiding the costs of the war. But even he had to admit the new territory was profitable. I sat at the mahogany table in the back room of the restaurant. The ledger was open in front of me. I was reviewing the Southside collections. O'Reilly had finally paid up. The heavy oak door opened quietly. I didn't reach for my gun. I knew the footsteps. Clara walked in. The deep bruising on her neck had faded to a pale, yellowish green, easily hidden beneath the collar of a crisp, white button-down shirt. She looked entirely different. The hollow, exhausted look in her eyes was gone. replaced by a quiet, steady resilience. She had put on a little weight, eating 3 meals a day at the estate. She held a white cardboard box in her hands. "Paulie said you were back here," Clara said. Her voice had returned to normal, soft, warm, completely lacking the harsh scrape of the rope. "Tuesday is counting day," I said, closing the ledger. "Have a seat." She sat down in the leather chair opposite me, placing the box on the table. She opened the lid, revealing 2 slices of dense, dark chocolate cake. "Lily helped me bake it," Clara said, a faint smile touching her lips. "She insisted we bring it to you. She's out front, helping Dom polish the chrome on the Cadillac. She's completely obsessed with that car." "Dom is going to turn her into a getaway driver," I noted, pulling one of the plates toward me. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. I ate a bite of the cake. It was excellent. "Dr. Harmon cleared me yesterday," Clara said softly, looking down at her hands. "He said the cartilage in my throat is fully healed. No permanent damage." "That's good news." She looked up at me, her brown eyes locking onto mine. "It means I can leave the estate. I can go back to work." I set my fork down. This was the conversation I had been avoiding. For 2 weeks, my massive, silent fortress had felt like a home. Waking up to the sound of Lily arguing with the chef about pancake shapes and seeing Clara reading in the library had fundamentally shifted the atmosphere of my life. "You can't go back to the diner, Clara," I said flatly. Her spine stiffened. The old defensive instinct flared up. "I don't expect you to keep providing for us, Leo. I have to work. I have to take care of my daughter." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I slid it across the mahogany table until it touched the edge of the cake box. "Open it," I instructed. She hesitated, then picked up the envelope and unclasped the metal tab. She pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents. She scanned the first page, her brow furrowing in confusion. "This is a commercial lease," she said, looking up, "for the storefront on 8th Avenue, the old bakery." "It's paid in full for 5 years, I told her. "The deed is in a trust under Lily's name, with you as the executor. The kitchen has already been retrofitted with commercial ovens. The syndicate owns the block, which means you have 24-hour security, no rent, and no neighborhood taxes." Clara stared at the papers, her mouth slightly open. She dropped them back onto the table as if they were burning her fingers. "Leo, I can't accept this. This is hundreds of thousands of dollars. I can't pay you back for this. I told you on the first night, Clara. I am not a loan shark." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "You don't owe me money. You never did. You asked me why I saved you. I saved you because of Lily. But I bought the bakery because of you." A heavy, thick silence filled the room. The sound of the espresso machine hissing from the front of the restaurant felt miles away. "You told me once that men like me don't do favors," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, quiet timbre. "You were right. I am a selfish man. I run an empire built on violence and control. But when I look at you, and I look at Lily, I want something else. I want to build something that doesn't bleed." Clara looked at me. The fear that had defined our first meeting was entirely gone. She saw the blood in my hands, she knew the monster I could be, but she also saw the man who had laid her gently on the back seat of a car and stood between her and death. Slowly, she reached across the table. Her hand, small and warm, closed over my knuckles. "You're a terrifying man, Leo Rossi," Clara whispered, a genuine, tearful smile breaking across her face. but you make really good choices in real estate." I turned my hand over, interlocking my fingers with hers. Her grip was tight, a grounding force in a world of chaos. Suddenly, the heavy oak door flew open, bouncing off the doorstop. Lily bounded into the room, her jacket zipped up to her chin, a smudge of car wax on her cheek. "Leo!" she shouted, completely ignoring the solemnity of the room. "Dom let me sit behind the steering wheel, but he won't let me turn the key. Tell him to let me turn the key." Dom's massive frame appeared in the doorway behind her, looking apologetic and slightly panicked. "Boss, I swear she's quick. She almost had the ignition." I looked at Clara. She was laughing, a bright, clear sound that filled the room and chased away the shadows. I looked down at our joined hands, then back at the little girl who had kicked down the doors of my life and demanded I find my humanity. I pushed the ledger to the side of the desk. It could wait. "Come here, kid," I said, standing up. "Let's go talk to Dom about driving lessons." And that's the end of Leo, Clara, and Lily's story. What started as a desperate plea in a brutal storm ended with the fall of a rival crew and the forging of an unexpected family. Leo proved that even a man built for violence can step out of the shadows to protect what matters most. Did you expect Leo to risk his entire empire for a waitress and her daughter? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this gritty mafia romance, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe for more intense audio dramas. See you next time.